Good morning. I'll be reading Matthew 5, 1 through 12. Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on the mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you."
All that Jesus was about, feeling excited and confused all at the same time, trying to figure out what it meant to be following Jesus and being involved in this new movement. There was energy and freshness, that life could be different, that Jesus was offering something better, more satisfying. Yes, Jesus was throwing a lot of new stuff at them, teachings that seemed new, yet they were hearing some familiar things as well. As good Jewish boys, they had learned. They had learned the rules, they had learned the laws, memorized them, and probably could be tested over them to see if they knew them. But Jesus was giving them these new twists, turning things on their head. Jesus was not discounting the law, things like do not murder, do not commit adultery. Yet Jesus was going beyond just following the letter of the law, extending it further and telling them such things as, don't be angry with your brother and sister. Cut off your hand if it causes you to sin. And love your enemy. Did Jesus really expect them to learn these new rules and follow them? Would there be a test? They had a lot to learn and understand and figure out. Jesus had indeed turned their world upside down. The Beatitudes, along with the Sermon on the Mount that follows, in fact, turns things upside down. There's certainly a poetic beauty about these beginning blessings, but if we look at them closely, they are both radical and impractical. We place beautiful artistic renderings of them on our walls, and then we move on to more practical things. We can spiritualize them in such a way that they define what heaven will be like, but there's no expectation that these will actually take effect in this world. And in fact, some believe that these instructions are indeed for another age to come and not for now. Yet we find in that prayer that Jesus teaches that his disciples should pray that God's kingdom come and God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. These Beatitudes are then not just some beautiful words, but God's vision for how the world should be. These statements genuinely describe a countercultural style of life that followers of Jesus. In a world of wealth and war, Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor and the peacemakers." Instead of violence and vengeance, Jesus said, "Blessed are the mournful, the meek, and the merciful." Instead of being satisfied with power and prestige, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." And in a world focused on security, Jesus says, "Be willing to suffer for justice." This vision challenged those first disciples and challenges us as disciples today to think differently and to see the world from a new perspective, from God's perspective. In 1997, the Apple Computer Company launched an advertising campaign entitled Think Different. In television, print, billboards, and posters, the series of ads featured 17 iconic game changers of the 20th century, people like Einstein and Gandhi and Amelia Earhart, people who were able to see things differently and not simply see what they'd been taught as the only way to do things. This Think Different ad campaign channeled Apple's countercultural vibe to sell its products that were touted to be revolutionary and that would change the world. And there's no denying that computers and tablets and iPads and smartphones have revolutionized our lives. The Beatitudes offer Jesus's Think Different vision, a vision in contrast to the political and religious values of his day. Those who receive God's favor are not the privileged classes of the Roman Empire or the Jewish establishment who are lifted up because of their achievements or their social status. God chooses to be on the side of the weak, the forgotten, the despised, the justice seekers, the peacemakers, and those who pursue righteousness. This idea of think different is followed up in the rest of the sermon, offering ways to live different, ways to live into this vision of God, ways to live looking at the world upside down through God's perspective. It is a call for action for disciples of Jesus to create the kind of world that God imagines. The early Anabaptist leader Hans Denk wrote, "No one can truly know Christ unless they follow him in life. We learn to know by following." Think different, live different. That was true of the early disciples who learned to know Jesus by spending time with him, listening to his teachings, following his example, and believing in him. Jesus wanted his disciples to live in the fullness of life, not just follow a list of rules. Likewise, we too as disciples learn to know Jesus by spending time learning these teachings and then learning to live different. The test of whether we know them is not if we can recite a list of rules or beliefs, but how we can show forth that we are disciples of Jesus, seeking first God's kingdom. Jesus invites us to embrace a path, a lifelong path, that transcends the bounds of do's and don'ts and internalize the DNA of God's vision. No matter how old we get or how long we've been a member of the church, we are always students, learning and growing into Christ-likeness, always living into God's upside-down vision of how the world is to be. It is into this vision that we, as a community of followers of Jesus, strive to embody the reign of God here and now as a foretaste of what God envisions for the future for the world. I grew up being challenged to live into the vision of God's kingdom by the book by Donald Crable called The Upside-Down Kingdom. Likely many of you have seen that book or read that or had been influenced by it. Just last year, there was a new updated version of it that was published and released after 40 years. Jesus' call to live into this upside-downness is still our ongoing task. We are still learning what this means. The world around us keeps changing, and so we must continue to learn and figure out how to live in faithfulness. We must continue to grapple with what it means in our daily lives to love my enemy, to not resist an evil person, to go the extra mile. Does Jesus want me to literally give money to everyone who asks? What if somebody wants to rob me? Should I just let it happen? So many questions about the details. What does faithful discipleship look like? In 1976, the More with Less cookbook was released. This cookbook was commissioned by Mennonite Central Committee and authored by Doris Jansen Longacre as a way to respond to world food needs. It was one way that the Anabaptist Church in North America was invited to live responsibly and choose a different way than the overconsumption of our culture. To think different, to live different in order to share food resources more equitably with the rest of the world. It offered ways to live more simply and joyfully. And a few years later, there was another book by the same author, Living More with Less, carried this idea of living more simply into other areas of life and not just food. This book filled with personal testimonies from people from all over who share suggestions on ways they had learned to live faithfully in the footsteps of Jesus. In the foreword of this book, the author writes, "Following and obeying Jesus Christ is never a list of responsibilities or rules. It is a perpetual response to the living God, rooted in commitment to Jesus." These books filled with ideas for living simply and faithfully are just one example of how disciples of Christ learn to live into God's upside-down vision. And I'm sure if we'd sat down, we could come up with lots more examples. Through all of life, we are students with the invitation to continue to think and live differently according to God's vision rather than to the culture around us. We need each other in this lifelong learning adventure. One of the practices that I have found most life-giving has been participation in Sunday school. My mother loved teaching the youngest children in Sunday school, and so I think I actually got to start attending before I was old enough. That was my start, being nurtured through hearing the Bible stories, acting them out, memorizing verses, listening to a variety of teachers, hearing stories of real people who live for Jesus. And in my adult life, I have participated in Sunday school classes in a variety of settings in a variety of different churches, with people in different stages of life trying to live their lives in faithfulness. Certainly there were times when Sunday school was boring and didn't really get anything out of it, but over the years, I realized how much I've been inspired by others. And I've been moved by insightful, meaningful things shared about a scripture passage or about something we were studying that took on new meaning and offered a new way for me to think about and to live differently. Learning together. Throughout the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus calls us as disciples to a life of righteousness that befits and establishes the reign of God. Jesus invites us to be stretched and try things that may seem impractical. But Jesus also invites us to keep doing those things that are important, those things that we know, like giving to the needy, doing service, fasting and studying and praying. Jesus encourages us to keep up these practices, not as rules or meaningless rituals, but in the spirit that God intended as ways of learning and growing. At the center of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus instructs his followers to pray, like is already shown at the children's story, this Lord's Prayer. It is a prayer that can help us regularly focus on God's vision. Some people like to pray it every day for that reason. It grounds us in those things important in kingdom living, like daily bread, forgiveness, living right, and the promise that God is in control of the ultimate outcome. May we continue to pray that God's kingdom will come and God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And may we learn to live in such a way to create such a world. May it be so. Amen.